Great.
All right, everyone, like I said before, this presentation is one that you do not want to miss. She's an amazing presenter and has a wonderful story to share. Michele Benyo is a certified grief recovery specialist, early childhood parent, educator, and coach, and the founder of Good Grief Parenting. After her 6-year-old son passed away of cancer, her 3-year-old daughter said, "Mommy, half of me is gone." This heartbreaking statement focused Michele's career as an early childhood parenting specialist on the impact of grief on young children, particularly after sibling loss. As a voice for the youngsters of grievers, she helps parents, early childhood professionals, and other caring adults recognize children's grief and provide the support they need to cope with loss and rebuild resilience for life. Michele has also authored the preschool curriculum for Camp Noah, a nationally recognized resiliency camp for children impacted by a disaster or a crisis, as well as training for Child Care Aware on the social emotional support children need after experiencing trauma. I told you, you're going to love her. Just by her bio, she does amazing things and she's got great ideas. So thank you, Michele. Next slide.
Okay. Whoops. I forgot to, oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. Okay. I don't know why that didn't go.
So for this presentation, we have disabled the chat so we can focus on Michele. There is a Q&A box there that you can feel free to add in your questions, and we can ask those to Michele at the end. We want to take a moment to request your attention just for a brief moment. In the spirit of transparency and respect for our community, we have some information we'd like you to read in the on-screen disclaimer. By taking a few moments to read through the disclaimer, you empower yourself with pertinent information regarding the boundaries of our knowledge sharing environment. I'll pause for a brief moment. Okay, Michele, next slide, please. Take a moment to read through this slide also. Then together, we will embark on this exciting session while we push boundaries and leave an indelible mark on the ever-evolving landscape of our early childhood education knowledge. Michele, without further ado, we welcome you to the ECE conference and the floor is yours.
Oh, this is so funny. I'm pushing the button and it's not going. That is so odd. Okay, I'll use that. Okay. Sorry about that. Well, I am so glad to be here, and I'm just really humbled by the introduction. You set expectations kind of high, but I do love working with both of you and working with UAGC because you're doing such good work, and we're all at this conference because we recognize how important these early years are and just what all that happens in the amazing little minds and bodies of early learners. And so I just really appreciate being part of this conference again. And I was fascinated when I became a mom by my first child. I was working in another field, but had been an educator. And I was so fascinated by this little person that I went back to school and got my master's in family education and became an early childhood parent educator here in Minnesota. And as a mom of 2 young children, I started work as a parent educator, and I got to go to school every day with parents of children, my children's ages. And I thought it was just the best world, best of all worlds. But as you shared in my bio, I was really thrown off guard by and confronted by something that I was just not at all prepared to manage. And that was when my son was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 4.5. And we battled that cancer, journeyed with him for 2.5 years before he died. And his sister said to me, "Mommy, half of me is gone." And I was faced with a part of parenting that I knew nothing about. and we had really been grieving through that whole 2.5 years because our world had been so upended, and my children's childhood was not what it should have been. It was not carefree as it should have been. And when my son died, the whole world acknowledged that we were grieving, but they did not see how deeply my daughter was grieving. And when she said those words to me, I knew that was a true statement because of what I know about early childhood development. And I knew her precious little 3.5-year-old identity as an adored little sister had been torn apart. And so I have now spent 25 years learning everything that I could about children's grief, and particularly sibling loss after the death of a child, sibling grief. And my daughter left no question in my mind from the very beginning, aside from what she said to me, even earlier when she was just 15 months old. The first night that her brother went to the hospital, she was distraught. She was 15 months old and she would not be comforted. She wandered around the house wailing, just making a sound that was inhuman and alarming to me, and throwing herself on the floor not to be comforted. So I share that story with you because one of the things about early childhood and grief is that until about the 1980s, we really didn't know that young children can grieve very deeply. We don't see their grief very readily the way we do with adults. And she just showed me from the beginning that they do grieve. And so when I began my work, what I recognized, though I was all about the youngest of grievers, as Tisha said in the introduction, but I recognized that if I'm going to help young children with grief and help adults to help them, I need to help the adults first, because we all learn our ideas about grief in our early years. And most of us, I think myself included, learned from adults who really didn't have any good learning when they were kids about children's grief. And so today, when we go through this session, we're going to kind of start in that place of looking at our own grief as adults and how that influences how we help kids, and then move on from there. But before I go into the slides, I just want to share two other little stories with you because, I've been a student of grief now for 25 years, and I think I've learned a lot, but I keep learning more. And I just wanted to share a story of a mom who told me about her 4.5-year-old who was having a discussion in preschool about emotions, kind of big emotions, as we talk to kids and help them learn that. And he shared with his preschool teacher a story about his mom hitting her dad until he died. And he was very, very upset and overwrought about this experience. And needless to say, the preschool teacher talked to the parent about it. And the parent realized that her 4.5-year-old was actually remembering an experience he had observed when he was just 18 months old. And he was pre-verbal, wasn't able to say a whole lot about it at the time. But her dad had been visiting, and he'd had a heart attack and collapsed. And she was doing resuscitation and trying to revive him. And the little boy interpreted this as her hitting her dad until he died. And so this is just another example of the way that children can carry these experiences, including grief, when they can't talk about them at the time that they may experience it. They're still going to carry it forward. And so I've been learning about this now, as I said, for a few years. But the other story I want to share with you is from a little bit different perspective. And that's my own experience of having gone recently to a class reunion. And when I got to my hometown, I realized I was feeling just a very deep and pervasive and painful feeling. It was very disconcerting to me. And I couldn't figure out what it was, because I'd had wonderful high school years and I was looking forward to my reunion. I didn't go with any trepidation. I wanted to remember and reconnect. But there was something else back there in that hometown, and it was my first love. And I had actually been engaged soon out of high school, ended up not marrying that man because he broke up with me. And at the time that that happened, which was, about 50 years ago, nobody talked to me about grief. Many of us have a first love that we lose, and we just kind of know that's part of growing up for many of us, and we file it away in our chapter of our lives, and we go on with our lives, and we find someone else to spend our life with, and we forget about it. And I thought I had done that. But I tell you this story because the body remembers grief. And that's one of the significant things that makes grief different from many of the other experiences that children have that we refer to as emotions. And I realized that what I was feeling was unresolved grief because I had never addressed that event as a grief experience, and I had never really allowed myself to grieve it. So I've learned that in order to resolve grief, we need to face it. We need to help children face it, look it in the face and name it and identify it and cope with it. And so when we're helping children with grief, that's what we need to do. And I will move off of this slide. I'll bet you're tired of looking at it. So I wanted to just tell you that today, my intention for you is that you're going to learn how to teach good grief in the early childhood classroom. And the things that I want you to take away are that you will, and I confess, I have a note here, I'm taking it down, that you will recognize and revise whatever ideas you have about grief that are necessary for you to change in order to process grief in healthy ways. As I know, when I was faced with my family's experience, I had to learn a lot of things that I hadn't previously learned to help me deal better with my daughter's loss. I want you to identify how young children understand and experience and express grief. And I want you to be able to use some good grief strategies and essential messages that I'll share with you today to support grieving children. And then also identify and apply 6 essential intentions that promote emotional regulation skills and equip children to thrive. So that's what we're going to look at today. We know that grief is the normal and natural response to loss of any kind. It could be, the death of a loved one, a lost love, a friend moving away, loss of health or loss of a job for an adult, changing daycares or changing in what's familiar and the security that goes with it for children. And so there are a lot of reasons that we can grieve, not just the death of a loved one. And sometimes as adults, we sort of discount what children are grieving because we don't really think it's that big a deal and that it's really worthy of grief. But grief is in the heart of the griever, and all grief is 100%, even kid-sized grief. Mark Twain said that nothing that grieves us can be called little by the external laws of proportion. A child's loss of a doll and a king's loss of a crown are events of the same size. Now, I want you to think about a time when you experienced loss as a child, and I'm not going to have you share it because I have an hour of stuff here. I'd love for you to be available to share at the end. And just as you think about what we go through today, You will probably think of your own childhood experiences that you had, and you'll probably think, I'm sure you will, hope you will, about how you respond to kids that you encounter who have been grieving. But as I said, losses are how we learn about grief. If we didn't have any losses, or observe someone else's losses and how they respond, we wouldn't develop an idea about grief. And so all of us do have something to start learning about grief by in our early childhood. And if you heard me last year, I'm going to share the same story, because I have an early story of grief that that to me is really kind of profound, in that I just experienced the grief again when I tell this story. And I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I lived up on the Canadian border on Lake of the Woods in northern Minnesota. It looks a lot like this picture. And I was at the beach with my family playing with Wally the walrus, a blow-up toy that was so fun to ride. And I fell off of him, and he scooted away from me, and the wind took him too far away. Nobody could reach him. And I had to stand on the beach and just watch him float and float and float off to the horizon. And I watched him until he was a dot. And to this day, I remember the feeling that I felt as that child, because Wally was gone. I knew I was never going to see him again. It was final. I understood that. And I really felt grief over that. Now, as an adult, of course, I wouldn't, but I did then. And I learned some things about grief from the way that the adults responded to me, because, of course, to them, this was kind of a, it was a sad thing. This kid has a toy and it floats away, and that's a bummer. But it wasn't a big deal to them. I had this big feeling, and I wasn't really able to talk about it with anyone and have someone take it seriously. So I learned that I just kind of needed to let it go and not talk about this feeling, and that other people weren't really interested in hearing about it. And I will say that that's sort of the response that I had throughout my growing up to loss and big emotions. And so we need to think about how we are with kids when they are experiencing a loss, and some of the ways that we respond to them might be that it's not a big deal. But there are a couple other reasons why we allow kids to be bystanders, because often we experience grief in our families and it affects the children too. But we don't really talk to little kids about those big things that are going on in the family. Another reason might be because we want to protect them from the pain of grief. And we think if we don't talk about it, they're not going to hurt about it, but they do. And the third reason that we may not talk to them is because we just really don't know what to say. We think of grief as an adult issue. And so how do we talk to children about it? So as adults, we just really do a lot of minimizing of grief. We learned that as children. And so the way that we do that in our own lives and with other adults is to judge the feeling. I'm sure that many of you will be able to identify with these as I go through them. And there are times when we think, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this bad about this. It's, we might say to ourselves, it's just a job, or it's just whatever. So we invalidate grief. We might go out and replace what was lost. If you lose your boyfriend, go get another one. No, that was not my attitude. But for some people it is. Replace what's lost. Try to get over it. That's the terminology that so many people use. And that's what a lot of us tell ourselves. Or we might just ignore or deny the pain and act like it doesn't hurt, not tell anybody about it, and not admit to ourselves how deeply we're feeling it. And we certainly don't talk about it, because that will just make it worse. And if we don't talk about it, maybe it'll just go away. We don't want to bother people with it because they don't really want to hear about it. We don't want to have that sob story. We'll focus on other things instead. We'll keep really busy so we don't have time to think about it. And we'll wait to heal and feel better in time, because we all know that time heals all wounds, right? Wrong. That's not how grief works. But these are the things that we do with our own grief, and we translate those things to children in the things that we say to them. And these are well-meaning statements, but they're really not very helpful. Things like, too bad, and we empathize with them a little bit, but then we, tell them to go play with something else. It's just a toy. I'm thinking again about Wally and some of the things they might have said to me. Play with something else. We can get another one. Don't worry. We often tell kids not to worry. We tell them it'll be okay. Don't cry. It's nothing to cry about. Let's get some ice cream and you'll feel better. You'll get over it. And these things are not always bad things to say. I just want to remind you, because I know we all say these things to children. A lot of times it is appropriate, but when we're talking about loss and grief and something being gone with finality that creates just this deep pain, these kinds of responses, and I know you'll realize by the end of our time today that they're just more helpful ways to respond to children than these very dismissive comments that we say to try to make them feel better. The truth is that kids are not going to feel better just because we tell them to. They're not going to just be cheered up out of grief. Their experience of grief, though we don't see it, is really a big mass of intense feelings and emotions that they don't know how to describe. That's what my daughter was communicating to me at just 15 months. She was feeling something she could not describe. It's a big, uncomfortable, intense, confusing, and scary feeling inside. The child might feel scared or insecure or confused or worried, anxious, powerless, alone, sad, or bad. Notice that there are a lot of things that they can be feeling other than sadness. And a lot of us kind of equate, myself included, I still sometimes with kids equate grief with sadness, because that's the closest thing I think that we can identify for kids that don't have the vocabulary yet. But the truth is they may not be feeling sadness as much as they might be feeling scared or insecure or confused. And so we need to be aware that their experience of grief is a lot of things. But what we do know is that they just don't understand grief and what they're feeling. And we are talking about grief. I work with families that have experienced the loss of a child, but there are a lot of other losses, as we've already said, and a lot of other things that children can grieve. But I do want to say a word about death, because that is something that when it happens in a family, we do need to address with children, and we don't know how to do it. And children's understanding of what's happened is so limited. And so their understanding of loss is that if something's gone, it can come back. And if it's lost, it can be found. So if you lost the baby, just go find the baby. They are very literal. And so we need to be mindful of the words that we're using. They believe that dead things and people can come alive again. It may be dead now, but it can come alive. They don't understand the finality of death or the meaning of the word forever, or what we mean when we say we're never going to see that person again. And they believe that we can go visit someone who's died wherever they are. We told Deanna she was never going to see David again. But she wanted to pack a backpack full of toys and send it to him in the clouds so he could play with it. And she just could not grasp that that wasn't possible, even though we started at that tender age to teach her about the truth of death. And there are 4 concepts of death that young children don't understand, that we still can start teaching them at this early age so that when they do start to understand more about death, they already know this information that we've given them, even though maybe they don't comprehend it now. And the first one we've already talked about, that death is permanent and it's irreversible. No, people can't come back. All life functions completely cease when someone dies. Their body stopped working. They can't talk to you. They can't sing. They can't eat or play. They can't run. They can't do any of the things that they used to be able to do. The flower isn't going to grow anymore. In fact, it's going to get brown and wilty. It's not going to do what it used to do. Everything that is alive eventually dies. And so we also kind of need to help them understand the difference between something that's alive and something that's not. Sometimes they think just because it moves, it's alive, and that's not always the case. And death is caused due to physical reasons. And this is an important one for kids to understand, because we know that sometimes they feel a responsibility when someone has died and something has happened. And we really do want to recognize that in the absence of accurate information, children are going to do something with grief and loss. They're going to come up with their own explanation, and it's probably not going to be accurate. And some of the things they may do with grief and loss are think that it's their fault. They said something mean, and now that person died. It's their fault. They wonder if they're going to die too. They know that nobody's happy about death, that it's not a good thing, and they wonder if it's going to happen to them. They worry about what will happen if their parents die. They feel powerless. There's nothing they can do about this. And around them, they see that there's not a lot that anyone else can do about it either. So it's really kind of a big feeling of insecurity that no one has power over what's just happened. They may feel betrayed or angry because the person left. Another experience with Deanna was the day that her brother died at home. And when she saw him, she folded her arms over her chest and said, "God should have let David grow up before he took him to heaven." And she was very mad with her little crossed arms across her chest. They may feel anxious because they don't understand what's happened, and now they just know everything's different. They may not feel like eating or sleeping. They may have tummy aches. A lot of times there are physical responses to grief, and adults don't always make that connection. We don't always recognize children's grief because it just doesn't show up the way an adult's does, and they are not going to be talking about it like an adult does. So, when you look at all of these pictures, any one of these children could be grieving. And the little boy in the top left corner, we might just think he's being very obstinate and uncooperative and belligerent. And the girl in the middle is just throwing a temper tantrum. And sometimes our response to kids like that is to just really try to get that big emotion under control and not think a lot about what's bringing it on. We might look at the little girl in pink and think she's pretty serene today. She looks pretty peaceful. She looks, she's well behaved, but maybe she's quieter than usual. And a lot is going on in her mind because she's experienced a loss in her family. Or the little boy that's playing with blocks, he's just playing, he's fine. Adults often make that mistake when a child's playing, but children use play to process things they don't understand and often to process big emotions. And the other thing about grief for children is that it's intense for them, as I've already shared, and they can't be in that intense place for a long period of time. So the other thing that's misleading for adults is that their responses may be kind of sporadic. I would be amazed sometimes at how we would have had maybe a very stressful situation, and my son would hop out of the car and go run off to play, and so would Deanna, and it was a huge stressor for our family, but they went off to play because that's what they needed to do. And the little boy, that's wiping his eyes, and the little boy with his head on the bench, those might be reactions we might identify more readily as grief, but any of these can be grief, and they're not always interpreted that way. So we just need to be aware of that. And so then we talk about emotional regulation, because that is one of the hardest things for us to deal with young kids this age. And, it's one of the hardest things for them to deal with too. And when they are experiencing grief or some other hardship, and we as adults are trying to help them regulate, so we're approaching it kind of as a problem to be solved, that may not be the best response for a child that's grieving or having a hard time. Let's just look at what emotional regulation is. I know we all know, but let's just look at this. It's the ability to respond to the ongoing demands of experience. Ongoing demands, they don't stop. Lots of demands. Kids have to deal with that. With a range of emotions, many emotions that they haven't really experienced before. They don't really know what it is. They don't know what to do with it because they're being bombarded as they grow up with new emotions all the time. In a manner that is socially tolerable, you have to behave in a way that's socially acceptable. I know you have this big feeling. And they need to be sufficiently flexible to permit spontaneous reactions, as well as the ability to delay spontaneous reactions as needed. And this was a definition by Lillian Katz, who's a pioneer in the field of child development. But this is what kids are dealing with emotional regulation. And that's an awful lot of responsibility in these young years. So yes, it's tough. And let's look at just a simpler definition, which is emotional regulation is the ability to modify or control your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, and your words. That's all, just that. So it's a big thing for children, and we know that. And so what children need from us is they need good grief. They need for us to have compassion, for us to have understanding, for us to recognize that they are struggling with grief, no matter what the behavior. And this is a good thing for us to keep in mind with kids every day in our classrooms. There are lots of different reasons kids act up, and sometimes they need a really firm hand, and other times they need more compassion and more understanding. And just to understand that with grief, it is a mishmash of all kinds of feelings that kids don't understand. And so they need what I refer to as good grief. And that's what we're going to talk about now. And Adele Faber says, when we acknowledge a child's feelings, we do him a great service. We put him in touch with his inner reality. And once he's clear about that reality, he gathers the strength to begin to cope. Childhood is the best time to learn about grief. We want to protect kids from grief, but I say let's help them. We're not going to protect them from it. They're going to experience it. So let's teach them about it. How can you do it differently? Here are a few strategies for you, and I will give you the slides, so you don't need to write all of these down. But I want to just talk to you about 6 things, and you may be doing these things already in your classroom. I'm sure you're doing some of them. But the first one is one that I want to talk about that I've already mentioned, and that is to honor grief, including kid-sized grief. And honoring grief doesn't mean you spend a lot of time coddling a child that's having a hard time. It just means that you acknowledge that there's a reason why they are feeling this grief and that it makes sense, that it is something that's valid. And it may even be just losing a blow-up toy on the lake. Include grief when you talk about emotions. And I think there are 2 reasons we don't do this. One is because grief we think of it as an adult emotion. We're not always sure how to describe it to them other than to say that it's sadness. And it is really so complex. It's much more complex than just a simple emotion. Grief isn't just a simple emotion. And how we can tell when it's grief and not just sadness is, first of all, is it a response to a loss or a change? And does it have lasting impact? Is it something you can cheer them out of? We can't cheer children out of grief the way that we can sadness, where we might say, oh, you can't have that, let's go do this instead, and make them happy again. It does, as I say, often involve other symptoms than emotions. And it just includes a lot of different sensations and experiences for children. And one of the things that the National Alliance for Children's Grief points out that I think is important for all of us to keep in mind is that children's grief is not an event. An event may cause it, a loss causes it, but grief is an experience. And so there's so much more to it than we sometimes give it credit for. And then take advantage of teachable moments. And I'm sure you already do this for a lot of reasons in your classroom. You see an opportunity where something happens and you talk about it. And I just encourage you to think about ways that you can talk about grief from things that happen in the classroom. Maybe a child brings for show and tell a grasshopper that they caught the night before, and when they go to show it, it's dead. And so there's a teachable moment to just talk about death and loss and how that makes us feel. There are lots of opportunities, and when you just are more aware of what we talk about today, I think you'll find more opportunities to incorporate conversations about grief and loss and normalize those conversations and make them more natural, because they are normal and natural parts of our human experience. Use books to teach about loss and grief. The other thing I have for you is a book list, because books are good things to use, but not all books are good. A lot of books are written for young children to kind of make them feel better, to make them feel fluffy and happy. But the books that are going to be most helpful are books that help them make sense of death and loss and grief. And so those are the kinds of books you want to look for. And the other thing about some of the other books is that they may present ideas about the person being with you, or that you're going to see them again, or maybe even angels and heaven is where people go. And of course, those ideas are very subjective and are ideas that are best left to the family to share with children. So I would just encourage you, anytime you find a book about grief and loss and death that's written for young children, to just read it and make sure that it really will provide learning and understanding for the child, and not just make them feel better. And as I said, I will give you a book list that you can start with. But I will mention a couple of the books that I really like. And one is Lifetimes by Brian Maloney. And he talks about the living and the dying of everything. Everything that lives has a lifetime and will eventually die. And the other one is, I think it's When I Feel Sad, but it's a series by Claudia. Oh, I don't have her name in front of me, but I have it on the list. She writes a series of good books about emotions. And one of them is When I Feel Sad. And it really deals a lot with things that cause grief. And I think even when we're using a book about sadness, that we can certainly talk about grief in that context with children. And then puppets. If you don't use puppets, you need to get one. If you do use puppets, you know that children will have conversations with puppets that they don't have with anybody else. They've got good advice for puppets. You'll be amazed at kids' wisdom when they're able to advise a puppet. And of course, the puppet can say things to children and give them suggestions that they hear differently from that puppet friend than they might from someone else. So puppets are just a really good way to have conversations with children. And then the last thing is to reinforce essential messages often. And I call them essential messages. People call them other things, but these are the messages I'm referring to. And they're just those messages that children need from us to tell them that they're capable and they're valuable and they're important and that their feelings matter and that we're there for them and we hear them and we care for them and they're safe, all of these things. And so as we are working with children throughout the day and encountering difficult situations, to remind them with words, but also just with our interactions and with our actions, that they are all of these things, that they are precious. And this is a way to really reinforce for children the healing that needs to happen when they're grieving. But of course, all children need these messages every day. So, essential messages. And what I want to spend the rest of our time today talking about is what I call essential intentions, because this is how we equip children to thrive. These are some bases of good grief and my good grief parenting way of parenting and helping kids, young children deal with grief. And these are just intentions that we have in our day-to-day interactions with kids, that we're going to give them validation. We're going to give them honesty. We're going to engage them in meaningful conversations. We're going to teach them about self-care. We're going to instill in them hope and optimism, and we're going to connect with them and make sure they feel that they are connected. So these are essential intentions. The first one is validation. And this is that, where we just begin, and when we do nothing else with big feelings, we can validate them. We can allow them, we can name them. We do this with children. We start with the birth to one age, helping children recognize and notice their feelings. And then in the 2 to 3, we help them to start expressing their emotions and naming them. And then it's older than that, 3 to 5, where we start helping them manage. And so all of these are parts of that emotional regulation that we talked about, and it all involves allowing and naming painful feelings, and then of course providing some guidance as needed, which is often needed. Agree with their feelings. Again, the validation is agreeing with it. One of the things my mother did with me when I was a girl that just drove me nuts, and it wasn't just when I was little that she did it with me as an adult, was to tell me, oh, you don't really feel that way. Yes, I do. So with children, again, if we're kind of inclined to think that we maybe don't get why they're feeling this about that. It's that kid-sized situation again. We need to know and trust that it's true for them and agree with their feelings. Model compassion and teach empathy. Read books about feelings. We talked about that. And then some of the essential messages that may help them feel validated are: you matter and your feelings matter, you're listened to, you are heard and understood. Honesty, I've talked about that a little bit. This is a really important one. We need to use accurate words, and that's why, those 4 concepts, we need to use accurate words and truthful, factual, age-appropriate information. And the accurate words include dead and died, not gone or lost. They don't understand what death is, true, but they can still get the word and the explanation from us, and they will grow into it having that understanding, instead of realizing at some point in the future that when we said their sibling was lost, they had died, and they kind of lose them all over again. So they really need our honesty, and that's hard for us sometimes, but really important. The other thing is to not make promises and guarantees. Part of our wanting to make kids feel better is to say, I'll always be here. You can always come to me. You may not always be there. We need to find ways to tell children that we are there for them without promising that we will be there whenever they need us, because we can't make that promise. And if death teaches us anything, it's that. And it can be really difficult for a child to believe that someone's going to be there and then have that person not be there. So avoid those promises, as tempting as they are. Teach about life cycles in nature. We've talked about that. And these are some of the essential messages that honesty teaches. I'm here for you. You can trust me. You're safe with me. Conversation is so important, and it's not just small talk. It's not just how are you. It's if they've experienced something that they're feeling emotions about, if they've experienced a loss even. We avoid the topic sometimes, but let's ask that child who's had a loss, what happened if we know their dog got hit by a car, and let them tell us about it rather than avoiding the topic. And listen, and you'll find out what they're thinking. You'll find out how they're interpreting it, and they will feel heard and cared about because you're letting them tell that story. And then they may want to tell their story over and over again. We know that kids at this age do that. We need to be patient with their storytelling. They may want to tell you the same thing over and over again, not because they've forgotten that they've told you, but because they're just really grappling with it in their mind, and they need to keep telling it to try to make sense of it. And so when they do that, maybe there are questions you can ask them, ways that you can explore that story with them and help them understand it more, and listen. Be that safe person. Avoid judgment of whatever they tell you. Don't tell them how to feel. Don't tell them maybe you shouldn't think that way. They're just telling you what they think. They're not asking for your input. Of course, there might be times when it's important for us to correct, but avoid that judgment. We've already talked about reading books. Those are just really excellent ways. When you read a book, we don't need to just read it from cover to cover. We can stop along the way and have some really good conversation. And then some of the essential messages that you're giving children when you have a thoughtful conversation with them. And you can do this with individuals and certainly with your group in your classroom. You're letting them know that their feelings matter and they matter, that they are important, and that they're listened to. Self-care is another one. This is, really helping kids understand that they're capable and they can take care of themselves. And it starts with you modeling self-care and self-compassion. And this may not be an easy one for us, if we're honest, because we're taking care of little people with all kinds of needs. And so we don't always do our own self-care, and we're not always compassionate with ourselves when we don't do everything we think we should be doing. So be mindful of what you're modeling and find ways in your classroom to do self-care as a group, to have a time where you do a favorite thing and each person can choose, or where you do something that makes you all feel better, like mindfulness or breathing activities, which I imagine some of you do with your kids. And just make sure they know that they are taking care of themselves when they do those things, and that those things are important. Also teach them to listen to their body and help them identify how their body feels when an emotion's coming on, because sometimes we don't pay attention to that. I know that's something I never really learned to do. And even as an adult, my emotions can catch me off guard when I'm not paying attention to my body. So it's good for kids to learn that. Give them healthy choices for self-care. This is another thing that maybe some of us need practice in. I know I'm a sweet eater, and once in a while it's okay to indulge, but I also need to recognize that there are other parts of self-care than just indulgence. And we can teach children healthy choices. Having a grief tub that has a lot of activities that they may enjoy doing, different tactile activities, different quieting and calming activities, a place where they can go and find something and recognize that they are taking care of themselves by doing that. And the essential messages you may be teaching them are that they're precious, they're important, they are cared for, and they deserve to be cared for. And they can make choices for themselves, that they can take care of themselves. That's so important for us to learn when we're young. Optimism. Model realistic optimism and a positive outlook, not just, we all know people who who are positive about everything, and that can get really old. It's not authentic. And we just really want to help people see the optimistic point of view. The positive outlook doesn't mean everything's going to go right, but we can look for things to go right, and we can plan for things and anticipate for things to go right. And then what are we going to do if they don't? This is all optimism. We can make lemonade. I've shared this story. I think of this when we've lost a child, that we have a big fat lemon and we can't do anything about getting rid of the lemon. We've got it. We have to do something with it. We can either bite into it and it's bitter and it's sour and we throw it against the wall, or we can put it on the counter and say, I'm not going to deal with this lemon, and we can leave it there and let it rot. Or we can say, okay, I have this lemon. It's nice and fat and yellow. What am I going to do with it? And we can make lemonade or lemon bars or something with that lemon. And we can teach reframing to children in this way. We wanted to do this, we can't do this. We have an opportunity to do this instead. And again, I suspect this is something you do with your children, teaching them how to frame something that they may not like or something disappointing into an outcome that really has some hopefulness in it and some positivity in it. And that's a skill that will take children so far. And then teaching them, what will you do about it, or what can you do about it? Again, it's not about us giving them optimism. It's about them learning to see ways that they can turn a situation into something better. It's empowering for them, and we want to give them that and let them know they're capable. Role play with puppets. Puppets can have that positive attitude and that positive outlook, and they're going to listen to the puppet maybe more than they would listen to you. And then remember happy endings. Remember last week when it was rainy every day. And then remember how we got that special guest that came in and did all those dances and songs with us and how much fun we had. That's a happy ending to a situation that was not happy before the happy ending. Help them remember those things. And then essential messages are, I know you can handle this. I believe in you, and you can look forward to good things. And the last one is the last intention that we have with our kids every day is to connect them. And this means that we respond with some kind of closeness, whether it's just a touch, whether it's proximity, eye contact. We are so busy with kids every day, lots of kids, and we can't always attend to each child. But I think it was Ann McKittrick earlier this week who talked about, when you're feeding one baby and another baby needs you, you can look at them and you can speak to them and say, I know you're waiting, I'll be there soon. And those kinds of responses can build connection even when you aren't physically able to be close physically to every child that needs you. Develop those ways of staying aware and connected with every child in your room. And then model compassion for each other, for children, and affection as appropriate in your program. Teach empathy and inclusion. And I know you all do work on empathy because that's such an important skill for kids to learn at this age. And it's a lot of what you do as you're fostering community in your classrooms and ways to include everybody, even kids who aren't feeling good or who are being grumpy or being out of sorts. We still want to include them as part of the community. And what are some ways we can do that and keep them connected? And again, that self-compassion and self-worth, we need for kids to understand that they are worthy of being a part of the community and that we want them there and that they need to recognize that they do belong there. And these are some of the essential messages. Again, you are important. You can ask for help. You belong, and I'm here for you. And all of those intentions that I've gone through really quickly have one outcome, and it's the bottom line of what we want to do with kids. And that is that we want to build resilience. And that's the outcome of those intentions. If we're giving kids those things every week in our classroom, we're focusing on those essential intentions and delivering essential messages in the way we interact with them, they're going to learn resilience. And the goal of resilience is to thrive. And grief isn't the only reason why kids need to thrive. They need to thrive just by virtue of being in the world. And so anything that we're teaching them about this topic of grief today is certainly relevant to our teaching of them every day and helping them learn resilience. And all of the essential messages they get when they're acquiring resilience are going to just keep them feeling more and more able to take on whatever they face in their lives. We tell them, I know you can handle this. You are capable. You can ask for help, and I believe in you. So good grief is all of these things that I've talked to you about. It's not having kids figure grief out on their own. It's not being afraid to approach grief with children. It's the good grief response to loss validates their reality and says, yes, this thing happened, and I understand why you're feeling the way you're feeling. It promotes healing. I used to tell my parents when I was a parent educator how magical emotion coaching is. And I don't use that word lightly. I just think about the time that my son was really out of sorts and just off the wall and really having a hard time. And I said to him, boy, you're just really feeling frustrated and big feelings right now, aren't you? And he said, yeah. And then it just all left him. And he just could recover from that place that he was in because I validated what his reality was. And that's a huge part of promoting healing and recovery in a difficult situation. Good grief fosters optimism and hope. Grief is a horrible thing. Loss is a horrible thing. The loss of a loved one is devastating. The loss of a sibling, a child, is devastating. But there's hope and there's optimism, and we need to have those things and help children and families have those things to go forward from loss. And then, of course, we're helping them build resilient skills for life. So we're pretty much on my time. I want you to think on your own, and I mentioned this at the beginning, think about children you've known who have experienced loss and how you responded. And, how did they behave? Wow, that kid that was out of sorts the other day, and I couldn't quite understand what was going on with them, but I wonder, think about it. How did they behave? And how did you respond? And how might you do some things differently in light of what we've talked about today? And then why is it important to teach grief? If you're still asking that question, and I doubt that you are, but if you are, unless we are intentional about teaching children healthy ways to grieve, and that's why I call those essential intentions, adults are going to pass on misguided beliefs and unhelpful coping strategies. And even if we're kind of aware, because we're getting enlightened as educators who want to do the best for children, there are other adults in their lives everywhere who are passing on misguided beliefs and unhelpful coping strategies. And we really need to be intentional about teaching children healthy ways to cope with loss and grief. And then to just keep in mind that grief isn't just an emotion that we get over like anger or disappointment or frustration. It lingers. And with children, it becomes assimilated into their view of the world for the rest of their lives. My daughter's view of the world is very different than it would have been if her brother had lived and grown up with her. It doesn't mean her life is awful. It doesn't mean that things aren't good. It means that things are different. And she had to assimilate her understandings that she gained at a very tender age into her view of the world and her view of competence and resilience and her ability to cope with everything that she encounters. So we're helping children with that. And then children who learn good grief gain resilient skills for life. They're able to thrive despite loss and setbacks, and they're ready to support others who struggle, because when they know how to do it, they're going to help each other. They're going to encourage each other, and they're going to grow up to be adults who know how to help people and support people who are grieving, and they'll be equipped to be a force for positive change in the world. And you can help make that happen. So you can always get a hold of me by email. Visit me on Instagram at Good Grief Parenting. Visit my, find more information and connect with me through MicheleBenyo360.com, and visit my website for more information. And I would be happy to connect with anybody who has a question if we have time for a few. I think I'm right on the nose here.